Not everyone who's attending the meeting today may be totally up to date on the situation of and the history and the trajectory of the Hazaras. So the event is conceived in this spirit as something that will be a moment to learn, a moment to share concerns, and maybe consider what our response collectively and individually might be. And so in order to address some of these questions, we have 4 panelists. I'm, by the way, Frédéric Mégret. I guess for what's practical about Zoom is your name appears anyhow, but I co-direct for Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism with Professor Nandini Ramanujan, who can't be with us today, but is as supportive as I am of this event, obviously. So to speak to those questions, we have Halima Bahman, who was born in Kabul, who lived through the civil war in Afghanistan, and left in 1998 following events that we'll discuss in more detail during the event. But she's now settled in Canada since 2007, and she founded the Hazara Women Organizations to help women and their families within the community, and particularly to raise awareness about the persecution and systemic discrimination against Hazaras in Afghanistan. So she has a degree in biology and psychology from York University, and has worked in addiction and mental health. So Halima, a warm welcome to you, and we look forward to hearing your views. We also have Stuart Russell, speaking to us, I believe, from Bordeaux. I guess it's the magic of Zoom, but we can all be in a great variety of locations. Stuart is an alumnum of the faculty. He's a refugee lawyer. He taught at Macquarie University School of Law in Sydney. And he was a member of the Refugee Review Tribunal in Sydney as well. And it's in that capacity that he encountered the plight of the Hazara. So he'll be able to tell us about his experience from that angle. He also works is the co-chair, in fact, of the Monitoring Committee on Attacks on Lawyers of the International Association of People's Lawyers. Next, we have Gregory Stanton, founding president of Genocide Watch, and a founder of the Cambodian Genocide Project, as well as the Alliance Against Genocide, former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Gregory worked for the US State Department and is one of the authors of the UN Security Council resolution that created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He also drafted the internal rules for the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, taught at George Mason University and at the University of Mary Washington. So a leading expert on the issue of genocide, which, as you will see, unfortunately, is in a lot of people's minds when it comes to the Hazaras currently in Afghanistan. And then last but not least, Derakhshan Qurban-Ali, who was, Derakhshan was one of my students back in the days, and she now is External Relations Manager at Canadian Hazara Humanitarian Services. She's been very active in the Hazara community here in Canada. She's a co-founder at Welcome Home, an independent and a researcher. She has had a variety of roles over the years: compliance director at the G20 Research Group, 6 Degrees Junior Fellow, He's a Scholar, etc. She works on a range of areas refugees and forced migration, international law, human rights, sustainable development. Anyhow, we look forward to hearing from you, Derakhshan, and maybe, in fact, I could start with you. I think it might help our audience if we provided a bit of context and history. I think people know about the Hazaras, but could know more, before we even get to the issue of their situation in Afghanistan right now. Who are the Hazara? What kind of place do they occupy in Afghanistan? How would you describe the community?
Well, to begin with, the Hazara community is an indigenous group to Afghanistan. We are a distinct ethno-religious group living not only in Afghanistan, but also there are significant populations in Pakistan. The exact numbers are unknown, but it's estimated between 15 to 25% of the general population of Afghanistan. And what distinguishes the Hazara people from the rest of the country are their ethnic identity and their religious faith. And so Hazaras are predominantly Shia Muslim in a predominantly Sunni country. We also have more Asiatic facial features, as you'll notice from, I guess, myself or the other panelists. The history of the Hazara people is very, very, it basically is a history that involves genocide, slavery, and dispossession. From the 1890s, there was a genocide of the Hazara people that essentially was the foundations of the creation of the Afghan state. So in order to create the state of Afghanistan, the Pashtun king Emir Abdurrahman, he had to quash rebellions of Hazara people throughout the 1890s, and that created a genocide that killed and displaced over 63% of the Hazara population as of the 1800s. And so following that, following the genocide of the 1890s, there was over a century of slavery, dispossession. Hazaras were sold in markets and basically denied basic human rights, civil, political rights for the majority of their history in Afghanistan. And there's been a lot of the issues today, they don't start today. That's what I think is really important to understand about the Hazara people. When you look back at the history of land dispossession, and you see these themes coming up over and over again today as well, it's not a new persecution. It's a continuation of historical oppression. And so the Hazara people, we believe that there are many different theories to what are the origins of the Hazara people. There are myths that are perpetuated by other groups in Afghanistan. Just to give some context, Afghanistan is not a monolithic nation. There are 14 different ethnic groups, major ones at least. So the part of the issue is that this diversity is not very well known. There's, I guess right now, there is no majority in Afghanistan. So we have 14 different ethnic groups, and none of them comprise more than 50% of the population. So we have like the Pashtuns, who are about 40%, and the Tajiks about 30%, Hazaras 25%. But there hasn't been an accurate census in so long, so it's very difficult to actually understand the demographics. But what has been distinguishing the Hazara population has been the persecution based on their ethnic identity and their faith. So from the origin theories that exist, what seems most likely is that the Hazara people, where their homeland is in Hazarajat in Afghanistan, which is the central highlands, it's a mountainous region. They have been there, we believe we've been there for over, for thousands of years, because you look at the Buddhas of Bamiyan, you look at the historical, evidence of the existence of people there who look like us. We believe we've been indigenous to the land for a very long time. And throughout the empires that have come through Afghanistan, the Mongols included, there has been intermingling. And so you see different tribes of Hazaras with different levels of connection to that history. But overall, yeah, we are an ethnic group that is living in Afghanistan with large populations in Quetta, Pakistan. And the recent history, goes back to the 1990s when it comes to the persecution by the Taliban. Following the following the Taliban takeover of the 1990s, the Hazara population was disproportionately targeted, and there have been ethnic cleansing campaigns against them since the 1990s, which we'll go into later. But 2001 was an era where Hazaras were granted access to these civil and political rights that they've historically been denied. They really advanced in education. I feel the Hazara areas throughout the 2001 to 20 up until present date have been the most peaceful in Afghanistan. So overwhelmingly, Hazaras have been supportive of the development of democracy and the support of the West's, I guess, development campaigns in the country, but they've been systematically discriminated against. And so a lot of the development and a lot of the a lot of the aid and the development in Afghanistan has excluded Hazaras. So you don't see a lot of development in those areas, despite them being the most peaceful in the country. So this is a brief history. Essentially, what we need to note for today is the fact that they have a long-standing history in Afghanistan. They're one of the major ethnic groups, and they are persecuted heavily on the basis of their ethnic identity and religious identity, not just by the Taliban, not just by extremist groups, but there's been systematic oppression and discrimination by fellow Afghans as well from different ethnic groups and hegemonic groups. So there's 3-4 different fronts of right now risk and persecution that exist. And I think that just to frame the fact that this is all contextual and an ongoing persecution.
So that's great, Derakhshan. Thanks a lot. Very enlightening. So thanks for bringing our attention to the importance of the longue durée, right? Of history. That these things are not recent. They're rooted in discriminatory practices that have been going on for a long time. We'll get back to some of those. I was particularly intrigued by this notion, the kind of powerful claim you made for the indigeneity of the Hazaras, which, of course, I mean, there might be a separate conversation on how that echoes, the situation of indigenous persons in Canada, for example, what it means to be indigenous to a place. But my understanding is one of the specificity of the Hazaras is that, did I understand this correctly, that their indigeneity, their belonging to Afghanistan is something that is contested by groups that would discriminate against them?
That is correct. And so basically every group in Afghanistan has at least a significant portion of their DNA from other empires that have come through, the Greeks and the Persians and the every ethnic group, even comparing, I'm talking from a scientific basis, we've done 23andMe DNA tests to compare. Hazara people have majority Central Asian DNA that comes from that region specifically, even my own. And so there is intermingling of every single Afghan you meet is going to have a diverse mix of every, Persian DNA or I guess Indian subcontinent. There is no ethnically pure Afghan, but the issue is like a lot of the Pashtun people are divided, by the Durand line between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They are a people as well, and so they have been divided by colonially drawn lines. So this is part of the issue in that, for example, Hazara people are a people, so are the Pashtun, but the fact that a lot of different Afghans view Pashtun and Afghan as synonymous. So there is this exclusion factor that has to be taken into account. But the persecution is not just based on that as well. I think that when you see extremist groups coming into Afghanistan right now, the rising influence of the Islamic State, sure. There's different persecution from different angles, and everyone has a different reason, but the overarching reason is the ethnic identity and trying to basically argue that we are the other, that we are Mongols or, and yeah, that is.
just powerfully reminded of the extent to which this has been a framing narrative in a lot of campaigns of genocide and ethnic cleansing. If you think of Leon Polyakov's Aryan myth and the idea of a Jew as a foreigner in Germany and Eastern Europe. If you think of a myth of the Nilotic Tutsi, right? The Tutsi are not from Rwanda. They came centuries ago down the Nile. They're really kind of Ethiopians. They don't belong, etc. So of course one could speak for days about the connection that is made between nation and territory and whether that makes any sense. Maybe a question for Gregory here. As a genocide expert, I thought it was really intriguing, and obviously I'm familiar with the 1890 campaign and killings then. Gregory, from your perspective, why is this not discussed more, and why, and we're now in an era where the killing fields, the Holocaust, and even the Armenian genocide are sort of amply recognized. Some, recognition now emerging of the Herero genocide, and yet somehow we don't hear of the mass killing of a Hazara in the 19th century. Is this something that's just waiting to be remedied? What are genocide scholars, doing and thinking about this?
I think that one of the problems that people have in recognizing genocide is that we're still living in the era of the myth of the nation state. Nation states were created that were around, that put together ethnic groups that really didn't belong in the same nation. They were even speaking different languages. They were, one was a minority, dominated by a majority and so forth. And so there's been a suppression by the majorities of acknowledgement of these minorities within nation states. We see it right here in the United States, where Black people and Native Americans, both victims of genocide, and yet the United States hasn't really ever come to grips with it or acknowledged it. The cases you mention are all good examples of what is created out of that narrative, which is an exclusionary ideology, in which one group is excluded from full participation or membership in the national group. And in fact, we literally did it here in the United States. Black people couldn't vote. Native American people couldn't vote until 1924. And you can argue that Black people couldn't vote until the 1960s. So this is the sort of exclusionary ideology we're up against. And the Hazaras have been particular victims of it because they are Shia. And that means they are considered heretics by the Sunni Muslims who control Afghanistan. So this exclusionary ideology is, one of the big problems that we face. And in fact, the result of it is, because we're still thinking in terms of nation states, the phenomenon of denial. A lot of people think the only genocides are the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, and Rwanda, because those were attempts to wipe out a whole people. But genocide isn't defined that way by the Genocide Convention. It includes the destruction in part of an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. And that's what's happened to the Hazaras again and again. As we've said, in the 1890s, nearly half or over half of the Hazaras were literally wiped out by the king who united Afghanistan. And then we've had other instances, and I think Halima is even going to talk to us about that. During the Taliban rule in the 1990s, massive numbers of Hazara were murdered. So I would actually ask that she maybe comment about that.
Sure, Derakhshan, Halima, go ahead.
Yeah, That's a good point about like how majority of people can be wiped out. So in case of Hazaras, they were not just wiped out, the majority of them, like the over 60% of Hazaras were killed, exiled, and the rest were also taken as slaves, right? So I myself have lived in Afghanistan during the civil war. While during my life, twice there was a genocide against Hazaras. One was in Afshar, where it was through these different groups that were fighting with each other in civil war. They have killed thousands of people in Gharb Kabul. And the second one was, this one I remember myself, that happened in Mazar-i-Sharif. And that one, the problem is not just that the world does not recognize Hazaras to be like the Hazaras caused to be a genocide. It's also that they don't even recognize, or no one does a research on how many people have killed. For example, in Mazar-i-Sharif, there is still not an agreement on how many people have been killed, where there is an idea of 2,000, 5,000, or over 10,000. From what I remember, thousands, over 10,000 of Hazaras lived in Mazar-i-Sharif. And after the massacre happened, when I or my sisters or my siblings went out and saw our friends, they were surprised to see us. They were like, wow, you're a Hazara, how comes you're alive? That's how great the extent of that massacre was. So basically, no one was supposed to live that massacre. And only people who had some connections with the other, like for example, my family were protected by my neighbor who was non-Hazara, swearing that there's no Hazara in this house, or people who did not look like Hazara. They only had the chance to survive. So I'm gonna just give a little bit of information of what happened, just to have a little bit more idea of what the genocide can look like. I know it's gonna be upsetting, but as a child, you know, it was, when they came, they did not consider who is a Hazara who's involved in any political parties, who is a Hazara who is a Shia or not, who is a Hazara who is you know, somehow rich or involved in any other areas of socioeconomic level. So they just came, and anyone who was Hazara, they took that person and killed him. So first time when the Taliban came to Mazar, majority of us tried to run away from Mazar and go into mountains. So for a few weeks we lived in mountains, literally camped on the mountains, and when they were gone back, then we came back. And the second time when they came, we didn't have, many of my relatives start to run, do the same thing. They ran to the mountains, but many others stayed, and they went to the street, house to house, searching for Hazaras, literally house to house, and say, who's a Hazara? As soon as they find out, they see this is a family of Hazara, they start getting the man, killing them right in the house or beside, in front of the door, and then do whatever other crime they could do to the rest of the family, and then leave. Among those victims were my relatives as well. So my friends, Hafiza was only 9 years old at that time, who was killed with her family because they took in a car. So they tried to escape the Mazar, but while the car was driving away from the city, they were shot with a rocket and killed. Like 7 family seven members of that family were killed, including 4 children, a woman pregnant, and 3 of her kids. The other families who were killed, they went to the house, they took the men, and then they put them in front of the door. Why the women were watching, by the way, here. The children are watching, the women are watching. They take the men, 2 men, a father and a son, another father and a son, and a cousin who lived in this house. They took them out and they killed them, and they left the dead body in front of the house. They insisted that no one is allowed to bury these people. So for a few weeks, they had to hear dogs coming and attacking the bodies, and they were not allowed to even bury their dead part. And after the mother came to my family and asked us, and I remember her vividly. She came, she said, please, like, she couldn't even cry. She had no tears. no complaint, nothing. She just came and said, please help us to bury our dead bodies. And my mother said, I'm sorry, we cannot, because if we come, we're gonna get killed. So they announced that no one is allowed to bury them, so we have to leave it. And she very sadly left the house. After after 2 months, I think, my mother finally went with the woman, went to the leaders of Taliban and say, look, there is a few dead bodies, and now there were just bones in there. We need to really bury these dead bodies. And they said, yeah, sure, go ahead, do it tomorrow. You can do that. And by next day, when my mother with this family went to bury them, the skeleton, what was left from the body was gone. So they removed every single proof of the people dead. So now I wish there was someone who could take all the names of the people, just like Faizi Khatib did, a historian who worked with Abdulrahman Khan in 1980, to write the names of each person who was killed. It wasn't that far away from now. It's just 20 years ago, right? 21 years ago. But that's the hatred against the Hazaras that exists in Afghanistan. And while the other people are watching, right? So it's not just the Pashtun Taliban group who are doing these crimes, but all other groups are also just helplessly watching or not even doing anything about it. This is because also even before these massacres were done, there is such a horrifying discrimination against Hazaras. For example, many of our families, even during the time of Dr. Najibullah, who was the president, we were not allowed to go to university. If we went to university or even in schools, we were called Hazara name, like racial slurs. We were called the school is not for us. The teachers were discriminatory against their students. So my uncles, for example, could never go to school because they went to school, they were always called names and humiliated in front of other students. So they had to leave school and never made up to go to university. Very few people were able to actually go to university, either because of the severe, extensive discrimination against them, or also because of the poverty that was there. So they had to do very low socioeconomic jobs. They had to keep, like, not get involved in any kind of political or social leadership positions, and had to live through that. So as a child, like even when I went to school, I had to constantly, I remember constantly I had to fight with my other classmates because they would constantly call me Hazara, and Hazara meant offensive word for some reason. It took me a long time living in here for me to understand that Hazara is not a swear word. And that's why when I co-founded the Hazara Women Organization, we could just call it a Canadian woman organization or whatever. But I said, no, the word of Hazara should be there. So the Hazara should understand that Hazara is not a swear word anymore. You know, you can call yourself Hazara and be proud of your identity, because that's what has been for longest time. Like, it was so many Hazaras tried so hard, and even now they're doing that. They call themselves any other ethnic group, and they say, no, I'm not a Hazara. No, I'm proud that my father is not Hazara. Such a thing exists. And unfortunately, I remember that you said that I'm doing a lot of advocacy about the discrimination and constant attacks happening in Afghanistan against Hazaras, but these discrimination has been traveling with people here. Like even in Canada, I lived in Uzbekistan, discriminations. Countless incidents happened that there were discriminatory, like organizations who are led by majority of non-Hazara leaders. Even in Canada, they are being discriminated. They're being very unfair towards the Hazaras, simply because it's such a culture now. You know, it's very easy for people to oppress them, because the Hazaras are basically comfortable in that position as well, maybe because they have been doing that for so long. They don't know there's another way. So my job is I try to make sure that, you know, I tell people this is not what we should live at, not at least in Canada. It shouldn't happen here anymore. Unfortunately, now that it's happening again. So from my experience, I experienced discriminations as just a Hazara child in Afghanistan, and then I experienced a genocide. Terrible experience. I cannot even have enough words to describe it. Then when I left Afghanistan, I experienced discrimination by other people, other Afghans against Hazaras. For example, when I lived in Uzbekistan and we tried to get ourselves like registered with UNHCR to come to to get resettled from some countries, because the representative of UNHCR and the translator of UNHCR was a Pashtun group, they did not allow 250 families of Hazaras to get registered as refugees. And these are the people who run away from Taliban massacre, which just happened in 1998. And I'm talking about 1999 and 2000. They were not registered. My family was stuck in Uzbekistan for 7 years with so many other Hazara families who were classified as businessmen, and they were not allowed to get resettled. Only after my sister became a translator at UNHCR office, that's when the issue came up, and they started to reevaluate the cases and resettled so many families, including my own family in Canada. And that happened to me so many times, where like I hear that story from constantly the Hazaras here as well, that when they go to give an interview, the translator who is not Hazara, they don't say the fact. For instance, I had an interview in Austria when I tried to file a refugee claim in there. My translator was also not from Hazara group, it was Pashtun. And I was trying to tell the interviewer that I'm a Hazara, and the reason why I ran away from Afghanistan is because the Taliban tells us. And the Talibans are a majority Pashtun group, and that's why I need a refuge in this country. The translator was not saying that to the interviewer, and the interviewer was angry, as telling me, you're a Muslim, you're wearing a scarf, you can live in a Taliban regime, why do you have an issue with it? And I thought, this is not the issue, this is, so basically, the reason I know that because I knew a little bit German, and my lawyer was there too, and he noticed, like, no, I see that Halima is saying something else, and he's not saying he's not translating. This is not why, just because Halima is a Muslim does not mean she fits in Afghanistan. It's because she's a Hazara, and the Taliban are being, they're killing Hazaras. So that's the level of discrimination. And it's such a systemic way that we have lived the discrimination in all these last 20 years of democracy in Afghanistan as well, unfortunately. And now we are even more scared, because now it's not just about we are not allowed to go to school properly, we're not allowed to be involved in politics, we're not getting enough funds to the areas that Hazaras are living predominantly, and being targeted by groups with suicide attacks. It's also about another genocide that can just go house to house and kill people. And it's already happening, by the way. My relatives, distant families, already yesterday I found out that there was 2 people who got killed. They came to just a family, found the 3 boys, young, beautiful boys, killed one of them, injured the other one, and took one of them, we don't know where. So it's already happening, unfortunately, and I'm not sure what the world is doing. And I'm really happy that we are taking part in this discussion, that hopefully in these discussions we're going to start talking about it, and hopefully something going to start from there, that we can save many people's life in any way we can. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, we're very sorry to hear the news about your relatives, and obviously this is an ongoing situation. There's a sense, unfortunately, of repetition, and I guess one of the tragedies that I note in one of the many tragedies in what you described is that things didn't really dramatically improve with the kind of return of some kind of democracy. I mean, after the Taliban, things were not great. So there's reason to think that they could be far worse with the return of Taliban, right? And I think you also remind us that genocide is a very complex phenomenon. Yes, there is killing, but the killing is always prepared. And Greg might be able to comment on this at some point. But the various models of the stages of genocide, without getting too technical, there's a sense in which you don't go from a harmonious society to pogroms in 2 minutes, right? These things are prepared, and in this case, they seem to have been prepared for a very long time. So maybe I think that's a question that I'm sure our audience would love to hear more about. Is one of the big questions right now is who are the Taliban, right? Who are the Taliban today? I mean, are they any different? Are they sufficiently caught up in their need for respectability that they might moderate some of their actions, or will they, as many clues already suggest, as soon as no one is watching, do what they did previously? Derakhshan, maybe what's your take on this? I mean, how concerned should we be about sort of a Taliban 2.0?
I think we need to be extremely, extremely concerned, because like we saw in Mazar-i-Sharif, right? And just for some context, for those who don't know what happened in the Mazar-i-Sharif massacre of 1998, that when the Taliban took over power in Mazar-i-Sharif in 1998, almost very quickly, they had conducted door-to-door executions of over 8,000 Hazaras. And the number is, again, if you talk to people, Hazaras on the ground, they estimate much higher, like 20,000, etc., for people who were never found after that. They were taken and jailed. Like, there's so many stories of people who just disappeared. So 8,000 is like a low ball of that number. What happened then? The Taliban didn't allow journalists, right? So there's very few resources aside from the Human Rights Watch report that happened to start recording those numbers. But the Taliban did what they're doing now, which is they banned journalism. They started, persecuting those who are in the free press. And so what concerns me right now is the fact that no one's asking, no one's holding kind of accountable, people are kind of taking face value that the Taliban say, the public relations face says that they're different now. And that's not enough to, to ensure security. In 1998, the Taliban governor, he ordered, like, this was an official on the radios, and there was an order to kill Hazaras because they're infidels. And he said that every Hazara between the ages of 7 and 70 are to be killed because they are Shia, because they are infidels, etc. This was not that long ago. This is like recent history. And so right now, a lot of the Taliban members who were in power back then are still in the ranks. I mean, I think it's very convenient to believe what the oppressor and perpetrators of abuses say, because it allows us to deflect responsibility to do anything. But if you look right now, we're already seeing signs that they're not doing what they're saying. August 19th, Amnesty International already has reported the Taliban are conducting brutal massacres and tortures of Hazara civilians in Ghazni province. We're seeing, and this is, by the way, the Taliban have cut telecommunication lines in so many Hazara areas and regions. So the fact that they're already not even allowing Hazara people to communicate with the outside world, that's of grave concern. If the Taliban want to be a legitimate government, they have to abide by, free press, or at least allow people to communicate. Because how are we going to even know? That's the concern right now. How are we even going to know if something worse begins to happen? We're already seeing brutality of killings, torture, and even history repeats itself, not just there, but also with like the land dispossession. Even back in the 1890s, throughout history, the Hazara people, their land has been taken from them. And when they try to assert their right to, have the right to pasture, etc., they get further massacred. And right now, even this past week, 400 families in Daikundi province, a Hazara province, have been forcibly displaced by the Taliban. They've been ordered to leave their homes, 400 families minimum. There's more reports every day. And they've been essentially not just, their homes have not just been taken, but many have been burned down and have been, so these families are now, already they had nothing in this, they had very little, they were very poor in that region. But like, my question is how are we gonna actually respond to reality? I think a big warning for everyone listening today is you can't listen to the perpetrator of abuses for an account of reality. We need to get independent investigations on the ground as soon as possible from the UN, from different states. If the Taliban is committed to being a legitimate government, they should allow some level of monitoring.
Thank you very much, Derakhshan. I mean, I'm sure no one is rushing to take the Taliban at face value. I mean, at least it seems so far there's a lot of skepticism and wariness. And thanks for reminding us how likely it is that they will fall back on well-worn habits and do what they've been associated with in the past. So I think both you and Halima earlier on raised a question which I think is pretty central. which is, how does one know genocide, right? So, or how does one know persecution or crimes against humanity? How does one detect them? And you know, there's obstacles, right? So one of them is distance. Another may be a diversity of versions about what is going on, and a diversity of assessments. Another may be that you know, the perpetrators will leave no one behind to testify, right? As Halima suggested, that there's sometimes a deliberate effort not only to commit the crime, but to sort of burn all traces of the crime. So I wanted to ask Stuart. I mean, Stuart, you were, if I understand correctly, hearing and processing asylum claims in Australia at the time, which I understand was one destination for survivors of pogroms against the Hazaras. How does one, what is your recollection of first encountering, right, at a relative distance, right, these stories? How does one piece them together? Obviously through a fairly narrow lens of refugee law, which only requires proof of persecution, not per se genocide. But you know, how does one become aware that something you know, clearly very grave is unfolding?
Okay, a very good question and a very difficult answer. I was a member, an administrative judge of the Refugee Review Tribunal from 1997 to 2004. At the end of 1990, 1998, 1999, there was a migration, a significant one, of Hazara from Afghanistan to Australia via Indonesia. They took leaky boats, literally, from Indonesia, and after a perilous journey, ended up on the shores of Australia. They claimed refugee status. Initially, the department took the view that either they were Pakistani because they had spent some time in Pakistan, or after 2001, that there was no longer a well-founded fear of persecution because the Taliban had disappeared. In 2003, 2004, I did a lot of these cases, and I, after a lot of research, came to the conclusion that there was systematic persecution even after 2001 because of the presence of Taliban across the country. It was not an easy conclusion to arrive. I had to do a lot of research and a lot of reflection. And after hearing stories of killings and threats and torture and disappearances and enforced removals and so on, I thought that was the only conclusion that I could arrive at. And perhaps the most vivid memory I have of that period is a woman in her 60s. She looked like she was in her 70s. She had lost all the members of her family, had been killed by the Taliban. She was a widow, and she was dying of cancer. I heard this woman testify in front of me. I broke down into tears. Now, as we all know, judges and lawyers are supposed to remain robot-like during these hearings, but I was so deeply moved by the experience, I broke into tears. After that, I came to the conclusion that having hearings for these applicants was manifestly unjust. So I did all the decisions on the papers. The legislation at the time gave us the power to dispense with hearings and to go directly to a decision on the papers. It was rarely used, but I thought this was a manifestly clear case where I had to exercise the jurisdiction. It was not very popular. In 2004, my appointment was not renewed, but I did the right thing. I had 100% acceptance rate for Hazara Afghans. I'm very proud of that, and Derakhshan tells me that there's a very large and vibrant Hazara community in Australia, and I'm glad that I was a part of that process.
I mean, that's a fascinating shift, Stuart, and from a kind of, I guess, a culture of suspicion when it comes to asylum claims that really individualizes and forces people to make their case individually that they're being persecuted, to a more collective, I suppose, sort of genocidal approach, where once one has come to an understanding that a group is being targeted as such, one can expect that these some of these procedures can and ought to be expedited. Gregory, maybe, I mean, I think, so behind all of this, right, is, I think, a gigantic question, right, which, for better for worse, structures our understanding of what's going on in Afghanistan and in other places, which is, you know, is there an ongoing genocide? And, you know, as an international law scholar, you know, I often need to remind my audiences that just because it isn't genocide doesn't mean it's not bad, and it could be crimes against humanity, it could be persecution as a crime against humanity, it could be war crimes, it could be grave and systematic human rights violations, it could be discrimination, it could be apartheid. You know, at the same time, there's a part of me who fully understands why you know, the label genocide is appropriate and amply deserved in some cases. Although I think we're now at a stage where genocide is, you know, it includes, I mean, genocidal processes and kind of genocide preparation, and then the destruction of a part of a group, which could be, you know, I suppose, I mean, I don't want to be too scholarly about it. The point here is not to intellectualize this kind of very difficult issue, but maybe ask a kind of leading genocide scholar, what, you know, how would you approach this if, you know, and not necessarily making the case in court, because that's not really what this is about, but making the case as a scholar. When would you know? What would be the really sort of telltale signs that, you know, the word deserves to be used in a particular case, and of course in this case? We can't hear you yet, Gregory.
Yeah, Genocide Watch sees genocide as a process rather than as an event. And so the result is that, in fact, we believe persecution is part of that process. In fact, it's the stage, if you will, or the process that comes just before actually what we call extermination or genocide. So you don't have to wait until lawyers conclude that it is genocide, you know, as defined in the Genocide Convention, to really declare a genocide emergency, that we have so many early warning signs that we better be ready to act to try to stop it. And it doesn't mean you send in the Marines. It means that you can exercise all kinds of other kinds of pressure to try to stop this before it does turn into genocide. Now we see in Afghanistan today, just as Halima was giving us some evidence from the 1990s and today, that the kind of discrimination and dehumanization that she described, by the way, a good example of dehumanization is what she described when the Taliban left bodies out in the street. And the desecration of human bodies is a form of dehumanization. It is one of the ways you know that dehumanization is occurring. Those are both obviously already present, and we have the organization, namely the Taliban. We have the polarization of the society in which, you know, the Hazara are discriminated against in such a way that they even have to live in separate quarters of Kabul. And by the way, as you know, last year there was a bombing of a school in the area in Kabul that killed 85 schoolgirls. Most of them were Hazara. That was targeted. And similarly, we have evidence that it's happening again in Mazar-i-Sharif and other places, and in the Ghazni area. So all of these sort of preliminary stages of the genocidal process are already underway in Afghanistan. And that's why we believe that we need to declare a genocide alert, even though I think you're right, that at this point, if you were trying to make a legal case, you'd have to make a legal case for persecution, which is a crime against humanity. But the actual early warning sign that we include in our model for prediction is already there. We think that Hazaras are very likely to again be targeted systematically by the Taliban. And that's why we have said to policymakers here in Washington and the UK and elsewhere, we need to issue a warning to the Taliban that if they start these massacres of Hazaras and even all kinds of other types of genocidal behavior. And by the way, the Genocide Convention isn't just about killing, it's also about keeping a group from having births, taking their children away, and causing conditions of life that are going to destroy the group and causing serious bodily and mental harm. If any of those things start happening against the Hazara, NATO and the US and other forces have got to say, watch out. We're coming back if you start doing that. We should have done that in Cambodia. I set up the relief program in Cambodia for Church World Service and Care right after the Khmer Rouge were overthrown. And one of the questions that I never had a good answer for was a question that was asked to me by a woman named Guy Mariam, who was a survivor. And she said, "Why did you abandon us?" I never had a good answer for that. And I feel that we're in that kind of situation again in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Gregory. And of course, I mean, the international community has been haunted by what it didn't do in Rwanda and before that during the Holocaust. And I think we'll turn our minds to that conversation about what to do in a minute. But maybe just for our audience, just to get a sense of how exceptional this is, in terms of sort of formally declaring a sort of genocidal emergency. I mean, how many of those are there around the world right now? A lot.
That's the problem. And it's why you can't just send in the Marines. I mean, it's why there have to be all kinds of other ways in which you prevent it. Okay, no, so that's fascinating. I had maybe a question for Halima, sort of related to this, and the question of agency in genocide and who's responsible for it. I mean, obviously, we've been talking a lot about the Taliban, and the Taliban of a sort of the. I guess in the sense of sort of the SS. I mean the kind of a government in the ruling party. But one issue. I mean, you mentioned relatives being saved by neighbors, and so there's always the question of people also reaching out, and we have examples during the Armenian genocide of Ottoman Turks helping Armenians, obviously during the Holocaust, the righteous among nations. I think one interesting dimension of this is to what extent the persecution is politically motivated and instrumentalized, or to what extent is it deeply seated? And with the Holocaust, there's was it the Nazis, or was it, century-old anti-Semitism that had always existed in Europe? So kind of wondering, is there in Afghanistan a moment when things were better? Is there a degree of marriage, outside between Hazara and non-Hazaras? Is there a degree of good neighborliness? In other words, when people are left alone and we don't have the kind of maybe kind of crazy regional Sunni Shia things superimposed, did you, growing up in Afghanistan, did you ever see, kind of brighter possibilities for nation building, or was this always a bit of an ominous context for the Hazara?
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, that's for you.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, there is a degree of positive stories too. So I remember living with majority of my neighbors very harmoniously. And there are so many marriages happening and between these different ethnic groups and races. I think that if the people are left alone, they eventually start getting more, now that all this information, vast majority of information available online and people having access to education, it will make the situation much better. But unfortunately for the Hazaras, because it has been like over a century, and because these people have been marginalized in so many different level of socioeconomic layers, that other people look down upon them, right? So they are like considered like a second class citizens of Afghanistan. So that can change if the education is allowed, if the poverty is left out upon it. For example, the majority of the Hazaras locations, the areas that are populated by Hazaras, they don't have proper schools, they don't have proper services. Even when the foreign aids going there, they are blocked, they're limited when they come to Hazaras. The roads are not fixed. And even though the Hazara people are the most passionate people about, and everyone can attest to that, about education and about freedom of women, but they are always kept in different ways to not reach that the higher socioeconomic level, and that kind of keep us still the nations apart from each other. They just make that more discriminatory or inequities condition. But I think, yes, if the political forces decide not to intervene to make more conflict in Afghanistan, and if the foreign aids, for example, Canada has pledged to offer huge amount of aid to Afghanistan once everything is cleared out and Taliban allows. If that aid goes to all people, including Hazaras, then that will allow this society to become a little bit more equal, right? I'm going to give you another example. In Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, there's an area called Dasht-e-Barchi, and that is around 3 million of Hazaras. Majority Hazara live there, and this area is the most poverty-stricken area in probably whole Afghanistan. There was a school that Gregory mentioned, where 85 girls were killed. That 85 girls were part of 7,000 girls going to one school. And that's not just girls' school. There was another over 7,000 boys as well going to the same school. So one school having 7,000 boys, 7,000 girls, and only around 200 teachers. Now you can imagine how the classes look like. They don't have even only under 100 classes, and 3 shifts. And this is happening while the NATO is there, while all the organizations who bring aid to Afghanistan are there. How does it happen? Why is the aid does not get to these people? It's because of the discriminatory principles that are there that doesn't even penetrate. The layers of systems that are already established by foreign, by us, by Canadian, by American, by all other countries who are there. So if those things are addressed, if all the aids go equally to all people, and if these other groups, different groups like ISIS and Taliban, or even Ashraf Ghani, who claim to bring peace and equality in Afghanistan, if they are questioned, if they are put accountable for their actions, for these discriminations, then there's a chance of people, yes, living together harmoniously. I say that I know that there's even discrimination here in Canada among the Afghan groups against the Hazaras, but given us the opportunity that we have, that I have right now, I'm addressing it, and it's very easy for me to address it because now we have all this accessibility. Everyone is able to reach the education and the resources. That's my opinion, but other people may have different.
It's fascinating. So by the way, there's a whole dimension to this that maybe we can address in the Q&A, which is the dimension of international community, if not complicity, sort of making things worse. And I hear you when you say these things, that the international presence was certainly not always helpful, which maybe problematizes somewhat Gregory's suggestion. But at some point we might want to send the Marines. The retort might be, well, we already did, and it didn't bring great change. But I wanted to maybe follow up on a kind of final genocide specific question. So maybe for Derakhshan, one of the kind of great sort of propaganda points against there being a genocide is, well, look, it's just conflict, right? Well, the Armenians were fighting, and the Ottomans did what they had to do, and the Tutsis were associated with the FPR. They were kind of invading the country. So there's always that kind of temptation to sort of, in Afghanistan it would play out a bit differently, but to sort of to dilute, especially by the way, seen from a distance, and kind of orientalizing tropes that are always quite prevalent in the Western debate, to say, well, this is very complex, and what can you expect? This is a country where there's no clear majority. So and that then dissolves, I think, the specificity of genocide, right? And in particular, something that we have probably hinted at in passing, but which is the special intent of genocide. So genocide isn't merely exterminating, persecuting people. It is doing so with the intent of destroying the group as such. Now, as we know, sometimes that's hard to prove, right? I mean, the Taliban persecute a lot of people. Do they particularly want to destroy them in whole or in part? Derakhshan, based on what we know of what has been going on and what is going on, how would we know, right, that dolus specialis, as lawyers like to call it, is present?
I think it's evident in every statement, every action. I think a lot of groups, and there's, by the way, this to bring attention to the Hazara persecution in no way or shape, takes away from the suffering happening across the country, which is very tragic, and we need to address that as well. But what we have to make sure that in these situations, like during the Holocaust, etc., like, yes, a lot of people even during the Holocaust were dying, but when a specific group is targeted for who they are, what they look like, and what they believe, with a history of oppression against that group that makes them more vulnerable, we have to take note. I feel like the Hazara people are the only people in Afghanistan right now who are being killed because of who they are, rather than what they did or what they believe. Like, who they are and what they believe is the foundation of the persecution. The Hazaras are the only people where you have buses going, in public transit. You have buses going through highways, and the bus gets stopped, and Sunni extremist militants order all the Hazaras off the bus and kidnap them. And again, Hazaras are the only group where 9-year-old girls are being beheaded because they're Hazara. At what point do we, I understand the need to put things in context, but it's so clear that there's a targeted, systematic attack against this community for so many years, and ongoing and escalating right now, that to believe otherwise at this point is really it's negligent and contributing towards their persecution, especially for I understand, like, there's a lot of suffering, and Afghans have a lot of tragic history as a collective, but what we don't see in the media right now is that when you see an attack against a girls' school, they call it in the media an attack against women and education, but actually it was an attack against Hazaras. When the maternity ward was attacked by militants, Sunni extremists, when they killed and shot newborn babies and nurses and mothers, the media missed the part about that story that focused on the fact that those Sunni extremist militants went to that hospital because it was in a Hazara neighborhood, Derakhshan. A lot of these attacks by the Islamic State, by Taliban, by other militants, they are targeting Hazara people specifically in these specific Hazara neighborhoods. Any attack in Derakhshan in Kabul, for example, that's a Hazara neighborhood. So that includes the bombing of a Hazara girls' school, killing 85 schoolgirls, attack against Hazara specifically, the attack against a Hazara tutoring center, killing more than 30 and injuring so many more students. That was a targeted attack against Hazara children and students. The massacre of newborn babies, same thing. We see the targeting of gyms, markets. You see honestly, the places of worship. They even, as the Taliban took over recently, they they attacked and destroyed like religious sites that are very sacred and important to Hazara people. So it's very clear that this is a targeted attack against this community for who they are, what they believe. And as they're killing, they're saying you are Hazara. As they're killing, they're calling them infidels. Even the Taliban are preventing them from getting on evacuation planes, saying you're a Hazara. We're not. They're even during the Mazar-i-Sharif massacre, like the reference to Hazaras as like cockroaches and having these kind of direct verbal and through action intentions set out. You don't need much more evidence to understand that not only are the trends indicative of the persecution since 2015, as Gregory pointed out, the Islamic State attacks have killed at least 1,200 Hazaras and deliberately targeted their hospitals and children. Not only have the Taliban specifically been persecuting this community for a very long time, like the evidence is also in their own statements. And you see Taliban fighters, there's a video released this past year. Taliban fighters specifically are telling Hazaras, you better, they're specifically threatening them and saying that we will kill you. Like this is a video that we can share after the fact, but this is the past year. And they're saying, because you're Hazara, we're gonna kill you, and you're Shia and you're infidels. So what more evidence do we need is my question.
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, let me interject here, because what you were suggesting there, Professor Mégret, were several of the typical forms or tactics of denial. One is, well, this isn't genocide, it's a civil war. Now that ignores the fact that most genocides occur during civil wars. The two are not mutually exclusive at all. In fact, genocide often goes along with civil wars. And I think that's one tactic of denial that is just false for Afghanistan and most other genocides. The second one is this whole thing, well, how do we know they really intended this? Well, for an individual, the way you judge intent is whether he or she was participating in the destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group and knew it. In other words, whether it's a planned thing and did he participate in it? That's for an individual criminal court. But for a state, the idea of intent is very, very different. For a state, because states don't have minds, they don't have mens rea, how do you judge the intent of a state? The only way you can judge the intent of a state is through the foreseeable consequences of a systematic and widespread pattern of actions by that state. And for that, the evidence is now pretty clear that the Taliban have had a systematic and widespread pattern of actions targeting the Hazaras. Those were the foreseeable consequences of their actions. That is intent. And that's all you need to prove intent, or at least it should be the only way you would need to prove intent for a state. So both of those ways out, both of those denials, and by the way, this intent thing is a favorite one of lawyers. And it's a form of denial. The other kinds of things where you have, trying to minimize the statistics, like they've tried to do in Mazar-i-Sharif when 8,000 Hazaras were murdered. Oh no, it wasn't 8,000, it was only 2,000. Well, wait a minute. That's another typical tactic of denial. What we've got is denial that is a very convenient way out for policymakers, so they don't have to acknowledge that this is genocidal killing. And by the way, one of the ways we know when denial is occurring is when the policymakers and the journalists and others call it not genocide, but ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing has become the chosen term for denial of genocide.
So I think there seems to be significant agreement between our speakers about this. But I'm also reminded, by the way, of in the study of discrimination, for example, the idea of intersectionality, right? So people maybe are targeted for a mix of reasons, right, or discriminated against for a mix of reasons, none of which are incompatible with each other. And I think what we have in the case of the persecution of the Hazara is both an ethnic and a broader religious element, which I think we're seeing replicated in Iraq or Yemen or Syria between Shia and Sunni, but which in Afghanistan takes the form that it really targets a particular ethnic group. So I think that brings us a bit to what is and what should be the response of the international community. And here there's really, in some way, a plethora of policy options. Stuart, maybe, I understand that exile and emigration and seeking refugee status is one of those options. I'm keenly aware that, for example, recently in Germany, we've seen a number of cases surface, and in Sweden as well, in relation to Syria, where among the there's a mix, obviously mostly bona fide refugees, and then sometimes among those groups, perpetrators of war crimes and acts of genocide who have since been prosecuted. Is that something you confronted during your tenure? And even if it isn't, how does one go about detecting it and maybe prosecuting the individuals involved abroad? We can't hear you, Stuart.
It's a very difficult problem. Normally, those cases would be screened out by security services before they were processed, either by immigration departments or administrative tribunals. But just going a bit further from your question, this is the international humanitarian crisis of our period, and there needs to be urgent and immediate action on many different levels. One proposal I would have is that rather than forcing refugee applicants to go through the traditional system, which is very long and usually requires a lengthy hearing, there should be an emergency humanitarian visa issued to Hazaras from Afghanistan to Afghans in general, because if you can prove, or to the satisfaction of the decision maker, that you are Hazara from Afghanistan or Afghan, I think that's sufficient for the issuance of that kind of a humanitarian visa. The other thing I want to mention to you is this. We have the Dublin Convention, and I'm glad you mentioned Germany, because Germany, faced with the Syria issue, decided that they would temporarily suspend the Dublin Convention. Under the Dublin Convention, if, for example, an Hazara from Afghanistan goes to Pakistan and then eventually ends up in France, they will be returned to Pakistan because they didn't make their claim at their first country of opportunity. That is a complete absurdity in the context that we're dealing with. And I think that individuals, lawyers, NGOs, humanitarian groups, we should be forcing states and especially immigration departments to suspend indefinitely the Dublin Convention for that reason.
Thank you, Stuart. It's so clear that the situation of a Hazara is dependent on an international context that frames how they can deal with the situation. And obviously, the refugee regime has been under threat from many angles. And we know historically there's a lot of hypocrisy, right? But I'm thinking in particular of Jewish refugees in their 30s and even during the Second World War who sought refuge in the US and Canada and Palestine and were denied entry. I'm tempted to ask Halima and Derakhshan, it's really important, right, to acknowledge that at the end of the day, this is both an international problem, and it's a problem that is fundamentally affecting the Hazara community, which I understand to have its voice. I assume its representatives, etc. So what today is your evaluation of what the Hazara community wants from the rest of the world? So in an ideal world, what will we be doing? Because I want to resist the temptation to frame this as a question of, what should we do? You know, and I want to ask it as, what are we being asked to do by the people on the ground who, you know, have to live with the consequences? So maybe you can address that for us, either one of you or both.
Sure. I can begin, I guess. I think what the Hazara community is really desperately asking for so many years is just to recognize our plight and respond to it. You know, we've been for years, not decades and decades, begging the world to just listen and hear the fact that we're being persecuted, we're being killed, you know, and then we're not safe as a community. Even when we go to Pakistan, you know, when all the refugees who have gone to Pakistan haven't found a refuge there either, because they're being persecuted by, you know, Sunni extremists in there as well. They go to Iran, they then face discrimination as like third-class citizens in Iran, and they don't have a lot of social political rights there. So it feels like wherever Hazaras go right now, they can't find this refuge, and they need to be offered this protection. They go to Indonesia right now. For the past, we have thousands and thousands of Hazaras right now in Indonesia, just in limbo for 7 to 10 years, asking for resettlement desperately from the community. And there is a suicide crisis there. There are thousands of people who cannot work, they cannot study because Indonesia has not signed the Refugee Convention. Same thing, you know, in India and Turkey. We have tens of thousands, we have hundreds of thousands of people who just need to be offered an opportunity to live and to work and to study. They're not asking for handouts. Actually, Hazaras are well known for their work ethic and for their, you know, being able to quickly integrate into societies. And what they're asking is for acknowledgement and recognition of their insecurity and of their vulnerability. You know, we need to prioritize these refugees in existing programs. For example, as Hazara civil society, you know, there are like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of applications that came to the Canadian resettlement program of the most vulnerable, where you have the most vulnerable group, and within that, you have the human rights defenders and journalists and Hazara civil society leaders who are specifically, they have targets on their backs for their, you know, ethnic identity, for their work, for their involvement with the international community. They're being targeted on so many fronts, and they're not getting any response from the Canadian resettlement program. And so what we're asking is just to be included and understood as a very vulnerable group, you know, in this conflict, and to be not like basically, yeah, just the basic fundamental rights, and have proactive action. It's not enough to just say, well, apply to the program. They're applying, they're not getting responses. We need to proactively resettle. We need to have policies that acknowledge their persecution. And just like Stuart said with his experience in Australia, like if you can prove you're Hazara and you can prove that, you know, you don't have a nation, you know, and you're displaced, you should be automatically approved for these like humanitarian visas to come, like to be resettled. We have a crisis right now, and we need urgent response, and we need to, like Gregory said, we need to tell the international community, or no, tell the Taliban, and basically we need to stand for the values we claim to have, basically. So if we're standing up against tyranny and for human rights, and if these are our values in our foreign policy, we need to show that, and we need to basically demand that these rights of persecuted communities be protected. And knowing that they're currently not, we have to offer refuge and
immediately
and proactively, because people are right now in danger. Halima, I'm not sure if you have anything else.
Yeah, that's a great point. What I would ask is that, so there is the refugee status, right? The thousands of Hazaras who have left and they're in limbo situation. If they could be prioritized, that would be amazing. That would be like, you know, that would be basically saving so many lives just by doing that. What else? The other thing that could be done is that the Hazaras in Afghanistan, so there are millions of them, right? And for the rest of those who are staying, if there is a way to just acknowledgement of them being persecuted can help actually our organization to raise awareness about this, and then they could actively make sure that the Hazaras are not discriminated against when they're giving aid to the people inside Afghanistan. That would be, whether it's about you know, developing schools for girls, or fixing streets, or I don't know, whatever aid that the other organizations, international organizations, go and bring to Afghanistan, they should make sure that the Hazaras are not blocked to receive them. That would be an amazing thing. Another thing that I have personally experienced is that in Canada, many Hazaras came here, similar to other countries when I have been there too. Because of this history of discrimination and being underprivileged population, they have the minimum connection to the resources, to the political parties, or to the people and authorities. They have probably the minimum, even education, access to education, all of those things. So that kind of put us at a level we don't have that much support system and connection to help people here who resettled and to help people back home. So if in Canada, for example, if McGill University can focus on our kind of consider Hazaras to get access to education, to the leadership skills and programs. That way we can grow out here, and then we could extend our help to other Hazaras in Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan who are in different situations. So that's something I have noticed, that this history of humiliation and discrimination has really caused mentally and socially has caused us to have a very low confidence, lack of connection, lack of leadership skills, and I hope that not just that, but also we are, for example, if I want to go to an Afghan organization to become a part of it, I will be blocked. I know it's a huge claim, but I can probably, when I talk to you, I can give you a proof. Even it's going to be hard for me to in Afghan organizations for me to be in a position where I can make a difference or I can make a name for myself simply because of being a Hazara. So that puts me in a position where when I apply to a university, for example, I will not be able to give a list of all the things that I'm going to do among the Afghan communities, right? So I hope that the Canadian society can actually help the Hazaras who come here to kind of have some access to all the resources that are here, specifically education, and that's our passion, because we were deprived of it for so long, and we are very passionate to get as much education as possible, to get education, and so that they can use that to help other Hazaras and also people in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Halima, and for reminding us of our collective responsibilities, including in host societies, and the importance also of the diaspora, I think, which you represent, and of these kind of chains of solidarity that run from Afghanistan to other countries via the movement of persons. I'm aware that we have very little time left, and I would like to open the floor. If there are any questions from the audience, you're totally welcome to put them down in writing. I saw that we are now fully Zoom literate, so there is a lot of back channeling on the chat function, and I'm glad that people have been exchanging views on that format. So any questions from the audience?
I think we see one from Dr. Mohammadi.
Dr. Mohammadi, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, it was a question that I wrote also there, and I'm sorry for my English, and I based in Europe, so I am listening to this important discussion that I was thinking that the first when we speak about genocide at the time of 1890 and that time of Abdurrahman, I think the most important maybe, and also one side of the thing, what Abdurrahman and that time did, that they created a narrative that Hazara is bad and they should be killed. So this narrative was among all the nations in Afghanistan, and somehow, and it was spread for a long time. And even among Hazaras themselves, and they were believing that they are bad. So as Halima said, that you see, even being Hazara as a name, it was so, and somehow it was a swear. So me as a doctor, as a student at that time, that in 1992, that I was trying to be through my practice in the hospital. So in some, I was not allowed to go to the for my practice to the surgery room, for example, just because I was Hazara. So it was not just by Pashtuns. So it was a kind of narrative. So it is the thing that how we can change also this narrative against the Hazara. I think it somehow it has been changed already, not because of I think I can say that because of the struggle that has been done by Hazaras themselves, especially in this 20 years that has been given the chance for Hazara people inside Afghanistan, and it is the first nationality in Afghanistan that they have used this opportunity in order to for education, for everything, and for all this opportunity that has been created in the last 20 years. And my question is that I don't know that now what we can do for those inside. That is the thing. If we see the reality now, exactly now what is going on. I was in Mazar-i-Sharif when Taliban came. The first that they said that those who are killing Hazara, they will go to the haven. But now when they occupied Kabul, the first what they did, because it was at the time of a religious ceremony for Shia and Hazaras people, they participated in this ceremony, and they were also they were speaking very good and everything. And what is the reason why they are trying to show this face? I think it is something that we should discuss about this. And I accept that that's reality, that they have not changed their beliefs on Hazaras. I think they are afraid. They are afraid that Hazaras are now more powerful, either inside, either outside. Maybe we can use this power in order to speak more, to do more inside Afghanistan, and to say that, yeah, without Hazaras, no one, and especially Taliban, cannot govern Afghanistan, because at the end of the day, we cannot move all Hazaras from Afghanistan. And there are millions of Hazaras that they are living inside Afghanistan. Thank you.
So, and thanks for really useful. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but obviously the governance issue and the constitutional issue are absolutely important, and nation building. You know, I think there's a negative element to avoiding a genocide, but there has to be a sort of, a positive dimension to that plan as well going forward. I'll take two final questions, and then we'll maybe have a very quick concluding observations, but we are past the normal finishing time. So Adam Alimi, and then Homira Rizai. Adam.
Yes, thank you for the excellent discussion. There's a lot of things I wanted to say, but so bearing in mind with the limited time, I just wanted to point out, and you partly mentioned it, that oftentimes these genocides, they come on the heels of international crisis. So in the last 20 years, we saw the failures of the war in Afghanistan, and how there wasn't really a concerted effort to make peace with all of the groups. So, how can we accept the, how can we hedge against genocide, so to speak, when we are not, when the international community for the last 20 years has not been interested in building sustainable peace? And even worse, they have now legitimized the group, the Taliban, right, which is not organic in Afghanistan. It's not indigenous to Afghanistan. So that's, that's the point I want to make. I mean, I think, the way we focus on it is a little bit too descriptive. The international community has always had a role to play, whether it's in, in the Armenian genocide, whether it's in Yugoslavia. So it's,
Yeah, thank you very much. And obviously, sometimes presented as a solution when it's part of a problem. Thanks for that thought, Adam. Homira, if I may.
Thank you very much. I just want to say thanks to all the panelists for their wonderful insights and very informative session. I just had quick questions on what should the international community do to safeguard the Hazaras now that Taliban are in power, and also why is it so hard for the international community to acknowledge and recognize the Hazara genocide, both in the 1890s as well as in the 1990s? Because, you know, on the 25th, on Saturday, it was the 128th anniversary of the genocide by Abdurrahman Khan, which, as mentioned by Derakhshan as well as Halima John, that more than 60% of the Hazara population got massacred. And there are a lot of evidence to show this. So why is it so hard for the international community to recognize this genocide?
I feel as if maybe this one would be a good one for Greg, the politics of international memory and genocide recognition, and you know, what the international community can do. And I think we need to really conclude and wrap up after this.
Well, having been in the State Department when our State Department was denying that genocide was going on in Rwanda for over 3 months, when it was obvious to everyone else that it was genocide. Human Rights Watch had declared it, and many other groups. But I was in the State Department, and our lawyers said, oh, we haven't got enough evidence of intent, so we can't use the word genocide. And of course, what was really going on there was a form of what I would call prevenient denial. In other words, denial because they'd already made the decision about what we were going to do, which was nothing. The US had just been in Somalia, had had a disaster and had withdrawn. And I know some of the people who made these decisions, Susan Rice and George Ward and a number of others, who didn't want another Somalia. They didn't want us to get into another, quote, civil war. And so there was this denial, and we didn't even call it genocide until June the 10th, 1994. So what you've got is a reluctance by nations to, first of all, call it by its proper name, and secondly, to actually take forceful action to do something about it, to prevent it. That happened in Darfur, where we had a real, very careful study of what had happened in Darfur, carried out under the supervision of the State Department by an independent group. And the lawyers in the State Department said, yes, this is genocide. And so we couldn't really, we couldn't avoid that. The Secretary of State, Colin Powell, said so at the UN. But he also said, this doesn't mean we have to change any of our policies, which, is a terribly disappointing conclusion, because the result was that, first of all, the UN tried to deny it by appointing a separate commission of inquiry that denied that it was genocide. And then secondly, by not providing a sufficient mandate for a UN peacekeeping force to actually stop the genocide. So what we had in both cases was a form of denial that resulted in non-action. What we've seen on the other side of it, though, is this: when it is seen that there is a need to intervene, it can actually make things worse. I think that was what happened in Iraq in 2003. And so I think we have to be very careful about how we take action to intervene. Now, in the case of Afghanistan right now, what I think we should be doing is making it really easy for people who are in Afghanistan and are under threat of genocide to come to our countries. We should have an open door. And I think that should be our policy. I think we've got plenty of room here in Canada and in the United States. We should stop this policy of pushing people back. And I really do think that is the best answer that I can offer, that we offer refuge.
Thank you very much, Gregory. Now, ever mindful of the fact that time is really passing, I want to give our three other panelists maybe just a quick moment for concluding thoughts, just a few sentences about, if attendees today were to remember one thing in terms of priority, what would it be? Derakhshan, you want to start? You don't all have to.
Repeat the last part.
Yeah.
Last question.
Sorry, there was a last question.
Repeat the last question, sorry.
Sorry, if there was one thing that you think we should remember from this event, or one priority we should turn our minds to, what would it be?
I think the number one priority is listen to the people, listen to Hazaras, listen to the Afghan people broadly, because they're telling very clearly what the reality is. We have to take, again, understand that the Taliban right now have a PR team so that they're not, so that the pushback isn't going to be as big. You have to listen to the voices of the oppressed and you have to prioritize them. And I think that broader, in terms of policy, recommendations, etc., we have to get to the source of this conflict. And in reality, I think until we start addressing where is the Taliban getting its funding? Where are these groups getting their funding from? What states are sponsoring the Taliban? We will never see an end to this conflict. A final kind of call to action is to have more talks like this and really look at the evidence right now. We have Chris Alexander, a former Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan. He wrote a report ending Pakistan's proxy war in Afghanistan. We have to start understanding the Taliban are not, some indigenous group. They're a foreign, sponsored, foreign created entity. And we have to discuss this reality and understand what that means for policy. Because if we don't address that, we're not going to be able to help all of Afghans. If you look at the sanctioned Pakistan movement it's gained traction among Pashtuns and Hazaras, and everybody across the board is asking the world to kind of look at who are the Taliban and why are they being sponsored to conduct this war in Afghanistan. Essentially, it's clear that they have been they have been created for a geopolitical purpose. And I implore everyone to just do more research on that so we can have real discussions about how to end this conflict, how to address it in the long term. Because if we are not addressing the reality, we're not going to get anywhere with this. This is a proxy war. This is an international war. This is not a civil, indigenous to Afghanistan group that just arrived and showed up. It's been constructed. Look into it, please.
Stuart, maybe?
A final word. I totally agree with Greg. Urgent priority is protection. Get the people out, get them to safe countries by safe passage. It requires a lot of coordinated efforts and especially a lot of money. There's some very good groups. Derakhshan is involved in some. Please give money, do something, act now. This is an international emergency.
Thank you. Halima?
I would say the same word as Stuart. So the people who are in Afghanistan, they're in the biggest danger. Do whatever you can, either from academic perspective, political, funding, support the groups to evacuate as many as possible, and focus the fund and the resources towards the Hazara people, both inside and outside Afghanistan. That would be hopefully somehow lift us up through this time, and then we could continue our support in future. Hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Halima. Thanks to all our speakers and to the audience. One of the words that came coming up was acknowledgement, the importance of acknowledging. And we hope that in our modest way, this event will be a part of that process of acknowledgement. And we look forward to further discussions on this issue and to keeping it in our minds alive, because it's not going to go away, and it's deeply tragic, and it does not have to happen. Thank you very much. I wish you all an excellent day.